Picture a bottlenose dolphin, one of the most intelligent animals on Earth, deliberately provoking a pufferfish, not eating it, not killing it, nibbling it carefully, just enough to make the fish release a puff of nerve toxin into the water. Then the dolphin backs off, hovers near the surface, jaw slightly open, and does absolutely nothing for several minutes. Marine biologists who filmed this were floored. This wasn't hunting. It wasn't an accident. It looked, for all the world, like getting high on purpose. If one of the smartest animals alive gets high on purpose, what does that tell us about the species that eventually split the atom, wrote poetry about heartbreak, and also, somehow, still can't agree on what actually happened at a party in the Bronze Age? Because here's the question we're actually here to answer. When did ancient humans start taking drugs? And the honest answer is stranger, older, and weirder than you probably think. We're not just talking about a handful of cultures with an unusual hobby. We're talking about a behavior that shows up on every inhabited continent, in societies that never met each other, built around plants that share almost nothing in common except one thing: what they do to the human brain. Some scientists think the habit goes back further than humans themselves. Stick around, because we're going to travel from Siberian reindeer piss to a mystery drink so sacred that talking about it could get you executed in ancient Greece. Let's set the stage. The dolphin isn't a one-off. Reindeer in Siberia hunt down a specific red and white mushroom, eat it, and then stagger around like they've had 4 espresso martinis on an empty stomach. Wallabies in Tasmania wander into poppy fields, eat the pods, and hop around in slow, looping circles, a real enough problem that Australian agricultural reports have had to include erratic marsupial behavior as a factor in crop damage. Jaguars in the Amazon chew on a hallucinogenic vine and then just sit there, staring into the middle distance, for hours. Researcher Ronald Siegel spent decades cataloging this and came to a genuinely strange conclusion. The drive to get intoxicated might be a fourth biological drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and reproduction, not a glitch, a feature. Which means that when the first humans found a mushroom, a leaf, or a fermenting fruit that changed how their brain felt, they weren't inventing something new. They were doing something animals had already been doing for millions of years. They were just the first ones who could tell each other about it afterward. So when did it start? Here's the annoying part. Drugs don't fossilize. A psychoactive plant rots. Smoke disappears into the air within seconds. The people who use them have been dust for thousands of years. The only way we ever find proof is by accident. A container sealed just right, a climate dry enough, a piece of luck geological in scale. Which means every single piece of evidence we do have isn't the beginning of the story. It's just the earliest chapter we happen to stumble onto. Somewhere out there is an older chapter we haven't found yet, and there's a good chance we never will. Here's a case that shows exactly how fragile that evidence is. In a cave in southern Spain called Cueva de los Murciélagos, the Cave of the Bats, archaeologists found sandals woven from esparto grass and, packed in alongside them, the seed heads of opium poppies. Carbon dating put the site at roughly 6,000 years old, making it some of the oldest direct physical evidence of opium poppy use anywhere on the planet. It survived purely because the cave stayed bone dry for 6 millennia. Move that same site 100 miles toward the coast, and none of it survives. None of it. We'd have no idea any of this ever happened. Now travel to the other side of the planet, high in the Andes. Archaeologists digging at coastal Peruvian sites have found chewed wads of coca leaf, mixed with lime to release the active compounds, dating back roughly 8,000 years. That's before the pyramids, before writing anywhere on Earth. And this wasn't a one-time experiment. Coca chewing became so deeply woven into Andean life that the Inca called it the divine leaf, reserved it for priests, messengers, and nobility, and buried it with the dead so they'd have something to chew on in the afterlife. Here's one you've probably never heard of, despite the fact that it's arguably the most widely used psychoactive substance on Earth today. More common than cannabis, more common than cocaine. Betel nut, the seed of the areca palm, chewed with a leaf and a pinch of lime for a mild stimulant buzz, somewhere between coffee and nicotine. Researchers examining human teeth from a rock shelter in Timor found red staining and characteristic wear patterns consistent with betel chewing dating back roughly 13,000 years. Today, an estimated 600 million people still chew it across South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, making it one of the single longest continuously practiced drug habits in the entire archaeological record, and most people outside that region have never even heard of it. Then there's a mystery that nobody has fully solved. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, written in India more than 3,000 years ago, describes a sacred drink called soma with an almost obsessive level of devotion. Verses about how it grants visions, dissolves the boundary between the drinker and the divine, makes a person feel, in the text's own words, immortal. Scholars have spent over a century arguing about what soma actually was. Ephedra? A species of mushroom? A now extinct plant? Nobody agrees. What we do know is that an entire civilization built devotional poetry around a substance we can no longer even identify. Here's where it gets genuinely bizarre. In Siberia, shamans traditionally used a mushroom called fly agaric, the classic red cap with white spots mushroom you've seen in every fairy tale illustration. The problem is fly agaric is also mildly toxic, and the compound that gets metabolized into its psychoactive form is more concentrated after it passes through a mammal's kidneys. So some Siberian communities developed an actual technique. A person would eat the mushroom, and then other members of the group would drink that person's urine to get a cleaner, stronger effect with less of the raw toxicity. Reindeer, who also love fly agaric, would seek out patches of human urine in the snow for the exact same reason. This wasn't folklore. Ethnographers documented it directly. Somebody, thousands of years ago, worked out mammalian pharmacokinetics through pure trial and error, with nothing resembling a chemistry lab. And that's really the theme hiding under all of this. Ayahuasca in the Amazon requires combining two specific plants, one that contains a hallucinogen your own stomach enzymes would normally destroy, and another that blocks those exact enzymes just long enough for it to work. Neither plant does anything remarkable on its own. Only the precise combination works. Someone, somewhere, in the middle of an enormous rainforest containing tens of thousands of plant species, figured out that exact pairing. Indigenous communities say the plants told them how. Western science has no better explanation. What we can say for certain is that ancient people across completely disconnected continents were running long-term, multi-generational chemistry experiments on the human nervous system, without ever calling it that. In Central Africa, the Bwiti tradition of Gabon centers on iboga, a shrub root containing one of the most intense psychoactive compounds known. An experience initiates describe as feeling less like a trip and more like dying and being shown your entire life before being sent back. It's used specifically as an initiation rite, administered by trained elders in a controlled setting, marking the transition into full adulthood within the community. Oral tradition there stretches back centuries, possibly much further, and the tradition is still practiced today, essentially unchanged. Not every ancient drug culture was chasing hallucinations, though. In the Pacific Islands, communities developed kava, a mildly sedative drink made from a pepper family root, used continuously for thousands of years in structured social ceremony. No visions, no ego dissolution, just a shared, ritualized calm passed hand to hand in a coconut shell cup, with strict rules about who drinks first and how the cup is held. It's a reminder that ancient drug culture wasn't just about touching the divine. Sometimes it was just about sitting in a circle with people you trusted and quietly turning the volume of the world down together. Then there's fermentation, which might be the single oldest form of drug production on Earth. In the South Caucasus, modern-day Georgia, archaeologists found grape residue in enormous buried clay vessels called cuivevri, dating back roughly 8,000 years, making it some of the earliest solid evidence of deliberate winemaking anywhere in the world. And in a cave in Israel called Rekefet, researchers found the remnants of what might be the oldest brewery yet discovered, beer-making equipment used by hunter-gatherers roughly 13,000 years ago. Well before anyone in the region had settled down to farm, people were fermenting alcohol before they had permanent houses. Fast forward to Mesoamerica, and you get a completely different relationship with the same idea. The Aztecs fermented the sap of the agave plant into a drink called pulque, sacred to the goddess Mayahuel, said to have 400 divine rabbit spirits representing every possible state of drunkenness. But here's the twist. Pulque wasn't a free-for-all. Aztec law restricted public intoxication so strictly that getting drunk outside of sanctioned ceremonies could be punished by death, with exceptions carved out mainly for the elderly and for priests performing ritual duties. Ancient people didn't just discover that fermentation could alter consciousness. Many of them built entire legal systems around controlling exactly who got to use that power, and when. So if drug use goes back at least 8 to 10,000 years with solid physical proof, and animals have been doing something similar for millions of years longer than that, where's the actual starting line? This is where one theory shows up that most mainstream scientists refuse to touch, and a growing minority quietly admit might contain a kernel of something real. It's called the stoned ape hypothesis, proposed by ethnobotanist Terence McKenna in 1992. His argument: as the African savanna dried out roughly 2 million years ago, our ancestors started following herds of grazing animals across open grassland. Grazing animals produce dung. Psilocybin mushrooms grow in dung. McKenna proposed that early hominids began eating these mushrooms, and that repeated, low-dose exposure across many generations may have sharpened visual acuity, boosted pattern recognition, increased sociability, and even nudged forward the emergence of symbolic language, all pressures that line up suspiciously well with the actual timeline of the brain, roughly doubling in size on the way from early hominids to Homo sapiens. Mainstream evolutionary biologists have real, serious problems with this. You cannot inherit the experience of a drug trip. Genes don't work that way. There's no direct fossil evidence a mushroom was ever eaten 2 million years ago. How could there be? And yet the part of the theory that keeps surviving contact with actual lab science is this. Psilocybin is a documented psychoplastogen, a compound that measurably promotes new neural connections and increased cognitive flexibility, effects that are real, reproducible, and still being studied today. Mycologist Paul Stamets, one of the most respected voices in fungal research alive, has said publicly that while McKenna's specific mechanism probably doesn't hold up, the broader question of whether psychoactive fungi shaped early human cognition deserves to be taken seriously rather than laughed out of the room. Is the stoned ape hypothesis correct? Almost certainly not in the exact form McKenna proposed, but it refuses to fully die, because if even a fragment of it is true, it means the species that built rockets and symphony orchestras got its start, in some small but real part, because a hungry early hominid on the African savanna ate a mushroom growing out of a pile of manure and had an unusually good afternoon. Here's what should genuinely stop you for a second. Civilizations that never met, never traded, never shared a word of language, kept independently arriving at the same conclusion about these substances. They weren't for casual use. They were sacred. In ancient Greece, thousands of pilgrims a year traveled to the town of Eleusis to drink a mysterious substance called the kykeon, as part of a ritual so sacred that describing what happened inside was punishable by death. Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero all reportedly went through it. In 2020, chemical analysis of residue in an ancient cup from a related site found traces of ergot, a fungus that produces compounds chemically related to LSD. Some of the most important philosophical minds in Western history may have built their ideas about reality on the back of an altered state. That's not one culture's superstition. That's a pattern that shows up on every continent that had access to the right plants, and the plants were never the same, but the impulse always was. And we're still catching up. Right now, clinical trials are showing that psilocybin can produce lasting relief for people with treatment-resistant depression. MDMA-assisted therapy is producing real results for PTSD that decades of other treatments couldn't touch. Ketamine is interrupting suicidal ideation in ways doctors are still trying to fully explain. After spending roughly 2 centuries treating this ancient body of knowledge as superstition to be stamped out, modern medicine is now spending billions of research dollars to carefully, expensively, arrive back at conclusions that shamans, priestesses, and coca-chewing grandmothers had already worked out through direct experience. So, when did ancient humans start taking drugs? The honest, slightly unsatisfying answer is, before the evidence we have, and probably before we'll ever be able to prove. Every decade the timeline gets pushed back further. Coca chewing at 8,000 years, fermented beer at 13,000, animal intoxication measured in millions. And somewhere underneath all of that sits the uncomfortable possibility that altering our own minds isn't something we picked up along the way to becoming human. It might be one of the tools we used to get there in the first place. That dolphin, drifting near the surface with a pufferfish's toxin working through its system, might not be doing anything so different from what a shaman in a Spanish cave did 3,000 years ago, or a coca-chewing porter in the Andes 8,000 years ago, or a hominid on the African savanna 2 million years before that. Different species, different continents, different plants entirely. Same very old, very stubborn instinct, looking for the door and walking through it anyway. And maybe that's the real answer to the question in the title. Not a date, not a place, a recognition that somewhere back before agriculture, before cities, before language was even fully formed, something in us already knew there was a door there in the first place.